So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone present here. Hope you're enjoying Sankalp as much as we are enjoying organizing it. Thank you for joining the session on building a resilient private sector through impact investments in frontier economies. Today, we have a spotlight on Mozambique. Joining us today are five eminent speakers. We have Ian Krohn, who is the director at Third Way Africa, which is one of the major private impact investors in Mozambique. Ian has over 10 years of business and development experience in Southern Africa, primarily in Mozambique, Renewable Energy Association. Emmett has over 10 years of experience in various roles in the development, social enterprise, and the impact investing sectors. In his current role as the Secretary General of the Mozambican Renewable Energy Association, Emmett is contributing to the incubation of a vibrant sector and ecosystem, also promoting energy access and renewable energy in Mozambique. We also have Sarah Fakir, who is the co-founder of Idea Labs, which is one of the largest incubators in Mozambique. I think Sarah has over 15 years of experience in business management and development. She's also worked in the oil and gas consulting and the development sector industries. So she has a wide experience across sectors that Mozambique is interested in. Sarah is also a member of AMBA. AMBA is the Mozambican Angel Association, which is the first angel association within the country. We also have Ms. Grace Horner, who is the Director of Relationships for Africa with the Development Finance Corporation. She previously worked with USAID's Development Credit Authority before the launch of DFC as US government's development finance institution in 2019. In her role, I think Grace manages a portfolio of partial credit guarantees and other financial transactions throughout Africa, which are designed to facilitate the mobilization of private capital towards underserved sectors. Before joining DCA, Grace worked with US Global Development Lab at USAID. And finally, special thanks to Tara Sevre-Collier for graciously agreeing to moderate this session. Tara is an early stage impact investor, social entrepreneur in residence at the SAID Business School, Oxford, and also the gender lead at Shell Foundation. She has over a decade of international experience across impact investment, international development, and management consulting. First, thank you all for joining us. We're grateful that you could join us for this discussion today. Today's session is a part of a larger project undertaken by the International Development Research Center and IntelliCap on promoting a resilient and inclusive private sector in frontier economies with a focus on Sierra Leone, Somalia, and Mozambique. Today, we will be focusing specifically on Mozambique, where despite the private sector's growth, economic growth, and ripeness, investments are currently low due to both perceived as well as real risks that we will be talking about. There has been very limited research on the impact investing landscape, I would say, in Mozambique, and the opportunities the country affords to both foreign as well as domestic investors. The project at hand intends to showcase business and investment opportunities in Mozambique by providing a landscape of both private impact enterprises and impact investments, including the ecosystem support organizations. I would like to start the session with a few data points which depict the current investment ecosystem in the country, along with the challenges faced by various stakeholders. I would just be sharing my screen right now for a small presentation. For this project, the team relied on both desk research and findings from primary interviews with around 40 conversations with impact enterprises, investors, and ecosystem support organizations from the country. So this is a summary of our discussions with most of the impact enterprises. Most of them have been operational for less than 5 years, are headquartered in the capital city of Maputo, have not been able to raise external funding. And even if they have been able to raise external funding, it has been through a grant or an aid, and many of them often seek technical assistance support from any of the investors that they raise. Majority of them are unaware of the term impact investment and are really not sure about the process of what do you say, how the investors source enterprises for funding. And many of them also do not prefer taking bank loans due to high interest rates and the need for collateral, which we would discuss furthermore in the course of the discussion. Secondly, we have, so coming to the challenges faced by the private sector enterprises. So again, I mean, this is just a broad spectrum of challenges. Of course, there are many more challenges apart from these. But the primary one is the access to finance. It remains a major issue for enterprises in Mozambique, with a high financing gap observed in the country. The rate of lending for, I think, SMEs and agricultural producers is close to 25 to 30%, which is prohibitively expensive, thereby restricting growth and profits for these enterprises. This is especially true for the impact sectors such as agriculture, healthcare, clean energy, which have a longer repayment period in comparison to other sectors. Banks and other financial institutions also have a strict eligibility criteria for loan disbursals, which is only met by some of the larger enterprises. And most of the small enterprises, especially in the impact sectors, do not have the collateral to pledge with the banks and as such are not eligible for these loans. Then you also have lack of infrastructure. I mean, you have very low access to electricity, poor road network, and underdeveloped water infrastructure. The business growth potential remains constrained. And despite having one of the largest energy potentials in Africa, only probably around 1 in 4 citizens of the country have access to on-grid electricity. The situation is even, not so great in rural areas where probably less than 10% of the population have access to electricity. This is a major impediment for farmers and enterprises alike. And the country also faces a lot of challenges with respect to logistics and has one of the lowest road coverages in Africa. Then you have lack of government support towards SMEs. Now, I mean, the government of Mozambique is very much interested in attracting foreign direct investments, but is more focused towards attracting FDI at a larger scale, say, for example, in the oil and natural gas and the mining sectors, which increase the overall GDP. So it's a big bang FDI investments rather than small scale investments. But these investments have largely failed to create a downstream opportunities for the small and medium enterprises of the country. Then you have the scarcity of trained human resources. I mean, despite education levels in the country, they have remained low, resulting in scarcity of and inadequate human resource capacity. The government of Mozambique has recently, I mean, it's committed itself to investing in education, and I think has allocated more than around 6.5% of its budget towards education, which is pretty high for in that region. And I think this will lead to a rapid increase in institutions of higher learning, and along with a focus on technical and vocational education. All right, now I just want to get into some of the, more data-driven points with regards to the impact investing landscape in Mozambique. So this is a study that we have done, and we have tried to collate all of the information that is available both from secondary as well as primary sources. Now, this might not be an exhaustive list, but frankly speaking, this is one of the first studies in Mozambique which collated all of this information. So I'm sure we'll keep adding to this. There is a significant mismatch between demand and supply of impact capital in Mozambique. Impact sectors, including agriculture, healthcare, renewable energy, and others, are often bootstrapped and grow organically. Impact investors have invested a total of almost $4 billion across 165 deals, and majority of these investments have been through the development financial institutions. We will talk about more of them in detail. Now, when it comes to DFIs, DFIs play a significant role in the development of impact sectors across Mozambique. DFIs have invested more than $3.2 billion, and more than 72% of the deals are directed towards the energy sector. I'm sure Emmett will speak more about that. Apart from energy, agriculture and fisheries has the largest number of deals when it comes to the number of deals. Uh, I mean, regarding average sizes, if you see, obviously agriculture and fisheries has a very small average deal size. Uh, some of the development DFIs such as GAPI have also worked towards creation of youth entrepreneurship initiatives, such as you have the AgroJovim project, which has resulted in the creation of almost 120 new companies and creating more than 600 jobs in the country. So those are also some of the indirect investments that have happened in the country. Then you have the investments that are used by DFIs. I mean, DFIs have invested through many of, debt, equity, you have blended financing, and all of those. But blended finance instruments have been utilized to a great extent by DFIs operating in Mozambique. I mean, 18 in deals totaling almost $300 million. I mean, majority of these, more than 90% have been invested in the energy, financial services, and manufacturing sectors. While a majority of them have been a combination of debt and equity, some of them have also included technical assistance and risk management as a part of the blended financing, which is actually great to see. And apart from that, we also have credit guarantees. They have been, one of the more popular instruments DFIs have used to try and increase financial coverage to enterprises. We primarily have DFC as well as SIDA. SIDA is the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. They have been very active in the usage of credit guarantees to create an impact on the development sectors in Mozambique. Financial institutions are generally averse to lending to SMEs within the country, as they're viewed as very risky endeavor. But these credit guarantees often include, they cushion the blow that financial institutions might take in case of non-repayment. These credit guarantees often are accompanied by technical assistance that's provided as a way to safeguard their investments and provide value addition to SMEs within the country. Again, now if we have to talk about donors are generally sector agnostic. I mean, they prefer to support enterprises which can create most impact, including in the agriculture and fisheries sector, healthcare, and clean energy. Most of the donor investments have been towards supporting the government of Mozambique in various sectoral programs, and only a very small portion of it was dedicated towards helping the private sector directly. So all of these deals that you say, we're not saying that only 100 odd million was invested by the donor community. Obviously, the official development assistance, which is the ODA, is more than $1.5 billion to Mozambique. But this is the direct assistance to the private sector within the country. Now, as expected, I mean, majority of the donor community have invested in technical assistance programs. I think it constitutes for more than 65% of the total transactions. This is primarily due to the low level of support available for impact enterprises across the country. Donors also have, donors in Mozambique have provide grants through, say, competitions and call for applications, which is actually very much, I think yesterday we listened to an enterprise from Somalia. Even in that country, primarily the first stage assistance is often very important for the growth of the company. Then coming to the private sector, we have, again, agriculture and fisheries are the major sectors of investment when it comes to the number of deals. But obviously, energy has a larger investment because of the need for it. And most of the investments in energy have been in renewable energy across wind and solar power plants. I'm sure we would talk more about this. While talking about private impact investors instruments, the impact sector enterprises are still in nascent stages and require small ticket investments. Most of the impact enterprises belonging to agriculture, fisheries, they require investments of, say, for example, less than 50,000 USD or 100,000 USD. Equity here remains a dominant form of investments across impact sectors. Some of the investors, we have the Bera Agriculture Growth Corridor Fund, or they've also provided concessional capital, which is a 0% debt, and innovation grants to agricultural enterprises. Over here, I just want to talk about for 30 seconds about the angel investment landscape, which is at a pretty nascent stage in Mozambique at the moment. The AMBA, which is the Association of Mozambique Angels, was formed in 2019 to provide advocacy, brokering, and investment facilitation for the impact enterprises or enterprises in general. Individuals can buy into the fund. The fund was created. There have been investors into the fund, but unfortunately, with the advent of COVID, the operations of the fund had to be postponed for a year. We have Sara Fakir, who is also a member of AMBA, to talk more about the aims and aspirations of AMBA in the next couple of years. Private side impact investors have been wary of investing in Mozambique due to a number of reasons, including you have the currency fluctuations, you have certain level of political instability, you have the high cost of capital in domestic markets. The hidden debt scandal has also has a huge impact on the confidence of impact investors in the country. The last investors, such as we have Third Way Africa, have tried raising funds to invest in the agriculture sector. And in order to overcome the hassle of fundraising in a defined time period, they have set up a permanent capital vehicle to invest across various sectors. We have Ian Crone from Third Way Africa to take us through the journey of investing in Mozambique. And finally, I just want to talk about some of the challenges, although I think we'll be hearing it from the investors themselves. Fluid political systems and coupled with violence and security issues are seen as the major investments for investors by looking to invest in the country. Investors do not have the confidence. I mean, it's not that there are major security issues in the country, but investors simply do not have the confidence that major policy changes wouldn't be bought in by, say, for example, the next government, which would affect their investments. The violence in the northernmost part of Mozambique in the Cabo Delgado province has the potential to derail some of the investments, and investors fear it might spread across. Now, again, this is where we talk about the perceived risk, if not the real risk. Then we have lack of legal instruments for creation of a fund. I think this is again a regulatory aspect which has to be dealt by the government, and I believe Mozambique government is in the process of drafting new laws for it. We have a real problem with syndication in the country, which is the creation of a new fund, and there is a restriction on creation of investment funds in Mozambique. Then we have bureaucracy. Again, this is a problem that we have in most of the developing countries. Mozambique has actually created APX, which is the investment promotion agency of the country. And again, there is an APX which is supposed to function and which is supposed to help out all of the investors. But more or less, during our conversations, we found that only the bigger investors seem to be getting a lot of support from the agency, and not a lot of smaller investors have been getting a lot of support. Next thing is the corporate governance. I think this is an issue which has plagued many of the developing countries. It is cited by investors as a major challenge while investing in the country. The enterprises often lack records showcasing source of funds, the revenue receipt, audited financials, and all of that. And when it comes to investing, DFIs have a much more stringent corporate governance procedure and requirements. And most of the enterprises do not possess these documents, and as a result, often end up without investor financing, which can catapult their business to the next level. Then the last one, the lack of adequate pipeline of enterprises. Many of the enterprises are not present on the ground in Mozambique, and this leads to a high cost of acquisition of possible enterprises. But I think one way they're trying to mitigate this challenge is largely depending on the incubators and accelerators for investment leads or donor agencies and NGOs who have a presence on the ground. Those are some of the challenges. Now, lastly, I would leave you with some of the quotes that we've received from some of the people during our conversations. Again, not to say that these are the only challenges, but we've tried and what you presented it to you in a very crisp fashion due to lack of time. But that is it from our end. From my end, basically, I would like to hand it over to Ms. Tara to continue the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Harish, for a great context setting. I'll do a bit more context setting before we open up to the rest of the panel to really dig into practitioner insights, especially from on the ground. As you alluded to, it's surprising how little impact capital goes to Mozambique. Considering it's the 190th by some counts lowest GDP per capita in the world, but at this precipice of massive growth, if its security, legal, regulatory, and ecosystem barriers for key sectors can be circumvented, which is where impact capital can really be transformative and catalytic. But yet, the impact capital is still not really flowing there in the way that you would expect. I mean, you mentioned this figure of a 3 billion in impact capital over about 20 years, but when you compare that to 45 billion in 1 year in FDI going to Africa, or 150 billion in total development aid globally in 1 year, you see how in the past 20 years, Mozambique has been really underserved, despite the vast potential. I mean, the gas reserves, and this is just one sector, there's some estimates that it could double or triple GDP per capita in our lifetime if it all goes well. Why would this not be a hot spot like Kenya, South Africa? Well, we know a few reasons for that. The legal framework and the business enabling environment are certainly not up to scratch compared to some of the countries like Mauritius or even the East African neighbors. We also know that a lot of impact capital comes from the English-speaking world and tends to favor English-speaking Africa. And to be frank, we're missing out on a huge opportunity for both economic and commercial gains and impact. When you consider the GDP growth potential that I've already alluded to, when you consider the potentially impressive gains that can come from energy, which can then spur manufacturing, which can then spur the agriculture sector, and given the geostrategic positioning of Mozambique, being able to access South Africa, being able to access East Africa, obviously the Indian Ocean, there's so much agriculture and export potential, which I'm sure Third Way Africa can speak to. There's so much tourism potential, and yet there are really, really scary risks that have kept foreign direct investment at bay, and there's several barriers which have kept impact capital at bay, but ultimately it's our sector, it's the impact investors that will be the ones for any market that's underserved or at the frontier. It's us that we're the ones that need to step up to take the risks to build the field, especially catalytic funders like foundations, which I represent, to build the field, to prove the exit strategies for our counterparts in PE, VC, to de-risk intermediaries such as GPs, and eventually the whole continuum of capital can come online if we can first step up. And that's why I'm so delighted to have all of the stakeholders on this call today who are stepping up in unique ways, whether it's from a sector angle, like for the energy sector for Emmanuel, or the agriculture sector for Third Way, or whether it's in terms of building new kinds of financial intermediaries and products, or building the ecosystem on the ground the way that Sarah is doing with Idea Lab. So with that said, I'm really excited to be here with all of you. Consider all of these factors going on in the landscape. Consider the strategies that we are currently testing and applying on the ground, and the way forward. So that said, I'm going to start off with a question for Grace from DFC. first of all, congratulations on DFC with the new name and new mandate under a new administration, Grace. Exciting things coming, especially with DFC's role in the 2X challenge. And so many of the other financial innovations you guys are spearheading. We know that you guys, DFC, provide credit guarantees to banks, which then expands lending to enterprises in the impact sectors. But we have also here, and this is particularly in the case of a country like Mozambique that's trying to diversify its economy, that there's a lack of diversity in the enterprises seeking loans, i.e. local commercial banks tending to lend to the same enterprises, same sectors, which is further exacerbated by the fact that in the banking system in Mozambique, there can be a really long bureaucratic process, really limited lending outside of the urban areas. So given all of these caveats, how does DFC view the advantages and challenges associated with providing credit guarantees to financial institutions in Mozambique? And how are you thinking about adapting your strategy in Mozambique going forward?
Thanks, Tara. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you all today to discuss Mozambique and particularly our experiences with credit guarantees there. I should note up front that, obviously the DFC has a variety of different financing tools. My role focuses on credit guarantees primarily, but, we have debt, political risk insurance, equity products, all available to use in Mozambique. But we do have quite a long history of providing risk-sharing credit guarantees to local financial institutions in Mozambique, originally under USAID's Development Credit Authority, now obviously with the DFC. And we continue to think they are a really important and powerful tool for a variety of reasons, although they come with many of the challenges that you mentioned. I think first and foremost, credit guarantees are mobilizing private capital, and in that way, contributing towards building sustainable commercial financing for SMEs in Mozambique. I think, that has to be the ultimate end goal. And even if we're not necessarily there yet, we must continue to think about how we can unlock commercial financing and make it work for impact enterprises. And particularly, one area where I think our guarantee is really powerful is that it can guarantee local currency lending. And that is often most appropriate for certain businesses. As a DFI, it's hard for many DFIs to provide that ourselves, but our guarantee can be applied to local currency loans and therefore allows us to support the provision of that type of financing. The credit guarantee also acts as a direct collateral substitute in many cases. And as Harish highlighted off the top, we see that as such a huge barrier in Mozambique in particular. Land is often very difficult to use as collateral. The collateral requirements are so high. So when there is a way for the guarantee to address that specific constraint, I think that can be very powerful. I've seen a case where a business, was able to get a loan under our guarantee where they didn't have sufficient collateral otherwise, and then we're able to use that loan to build assets that then could be used as collateral for future loans that weren't guaranteed. So that's kind of the ideal case of sustainability and how the guarantee can act as a catalyst. But obviously it doesn't always occur that way for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. So I think what's important to keep in mind is that, the credit guarantee is addressing one piece of a very large puzzle of access to finance. And the key is designing, this product in a way and deploying it in a way where it's being complemented by some other interventions and other tools to try to look at the picture as a whole. So one thing we're looking at, this is something we've already done in the past, but what we really are committed to is making sure our guarantees can be paired with technical assistance, both at the SME level to assist SMEs in becoming creditworthy, or often demonstrating their creditworthiness, which may already exist, but in a way that makes sense to banks and fits in banks' requirements, as well as technical assistance to banks themselves and financial institutions themselves to help them build loan products that are geared towards SMEs, structure appropriate risk assessment criteria, credit assessment policies, et cetera, simplify procedures. I think that's really been proven to be an effective strategy. We also, something we've done in the past, but we'll continue to do is looking at how we can, build in specific targets and requirements to our credit guarantees to ensure that diversification is occurring. Having a certain percentage of loans go to new borrowers, or to women borrowers, or to borrowers outside of urban areas, are all things that we've done and will continue to do with our credit guarantee product. But then finally, I think we also do recognize that, commercial bank financing, even with a guarantee, isn't always the best option for impact enterprises. So we are very interested in how we can apply the credit guarantee tool with other types of institutions outside of commercial banks. We've worked with microfinance institutions in the past, have seen some success there. But also investment funds. This isn't something we've done in Mozambique. We've done it elsewhere, but I think it has high potential to apply our guarantee either at the level of investors coming into a fund or on the underlying investments. But regardless, I think can be effectively used there as well to de-risk fundraising for investment funds. Which, in some cases, as you've mentioned, can be more impact focused than commercial banks.
You pointed to such a great point, Grace. I mean, it's all about having all of the different kinds of commercial structures and financial institutions on the ground to fill the different types of needs for different types of capital. And commercial banks are key. They're fundamental, perhaps even some would say foundational. But of course, we need the other kinds of vehicles and the PE and VC funds as well. So that said, Ian, I understand that Third Way has set up a permanent capital vehicle for ag investments into Mozambique. So I'd love to understand the background and why you decided that fund structure was more suitable for Mozambique or frontier economies like Mozambique.
Great question. So yes, just thanks for having me. Great to be here. Third Way Africa manages several different vehicles. The one that you bring up is called the Rural Development Corporation. And this is a permanent capital vehicle. It's focused on attracting very patient capital to the region. And as the name says, is focused on rural development of the regions that we're investing in and the local communities that we're investing in. And I think that a permanent capital vehicle works really well for this type of investment, I think for kind of two primary reasons. One of them is the impact side of things, in the fact that we are committed to sustainably developing the communities in which we invest. And we need to guarantee a level of continuity in that impact over time. And so it makes more sense to invest over a much longer term horizon and essentially guarantee the same ownership structure. The other portion of things is what you sort of mentioned in the intro, Tara, is exits. In a place like Mozambique, there is not a developed secondary market. We barely have a public market. And so the idea of IPOing a rural agricultural investment in a place like Mozambique is essentially off the table. And then there aren't essentially a really developed market of larger private funds that are essentially looking to acquire the types of assets that we're invested into. And so that essentially leaves you with management buyouts or some sort of strategic acquisition. And those are both things that take a good deal of investment, both from a financial investment as well as a timing investment to come to fruition in a place like rural Mozambique. And so we've just made the strategic decision that we would rather devote and deploy those resources to the operations of our holdings. I think that the huge value add of a private equity model in a place like Mozambique really is in the operational side. We're not doing much financial engineering. We're really investing in what we think are assets that over the long run are going to be highly valuable if we're able to inject a level of strategic and operational expertise into them. And so it allows us the ability to not only focus on investing in the operations, but also focus more time and effort into our impact strategy, as opposed to investing resources into an eventual exit because we have a short-term time horizon.
That makes a lot of sense. Turning to another core sector, which is equally close to my heart as agriculture, which is energy. Obviously at SF, we focus a lot on energy, and there's so much potential in Mozambique. while at the same time, I believe the rate of electrification is about 25%. And you can correct. I know energy, the sector has gotten some of the highest foreign investment out of all sectors in the country. But what are you seeing as the challenges faced by enterprises on the ground and accessing these types of investment, and how do these vary across stages, early to mid to late stage enterprises?
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you one and all, and to SunCalp for this opportunity to be here to engage on this topic. I do right off just want to, before I, as a point of departure, before I give you my response, I would just like to maybe dovetail quickly with some observations, made by all the speakers thus far. The Mozambican market, whether we're looking at a specific sector or a subsector, so if we're looking at energy, renewable energy, or mini grids within renewable energy, we're talking about sectors that are commensurately, rounding errors when we look at the regional markets, the African market on a broader basis, and these markets writ large. So we're talking about, purchasing power, if we control for GDP in Mozambique below 15 billion. If we look at the energy sector, if we look at the subsector of renewable energy within it, I mean, we're talking about very tangible projects, very tangible investments, and maybe just to highlight something, a key focus that we need to look at across the sectors is at project development, looking at early stage hand-holding. One of the the traits and the approaches and the modus operandi that I love in third way Africa, and one that we need to encourage and promote more across the board. And I think we could get into some of the structural issues at play as far as the sector, the service providers, and I think Grace, you provoked a lot of specific issues. But Tara, maybe just to get a quick response to your question, which requires a lot of unpacking. When we speak about renewable energy, when we speak about energy access in Mozambique, you asked, what is energy access? We can punch around a lot of different numbers, 25%, 35%, but the key objective is that right now we've taken on the commitment to reaching 100% energy access or electrification by 2030, which is a tall order. And so if we look at just what the sector requires, not just in terms of transmission lines and distribution lines and household connections, but the range of different business models, distributed energy service companies, energy access business models that are required. We also will require not just support from the donors or from government, but from the private sector also. And does that regulatory framework and that landscape exist in Mozambique? Do the capital actors, do the capital partners exist for incubating a nascent sector? We can look to the parastatal utility in the context of Mozambique as being one of the key drivers in energy access, but we also need to have a diverse, let's say, energy service provider sector that's comprised of private sector actors. And what does that take to incubate? I love Harish's presentation and the reports and some of the hard numbers that comes with it, because we're not just looking at energy access, we're looking at the economy writ large. And a lot of the key lessons learned and a lot of the findings there, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about energy access or renewable energy, these are themes that are cross-sectoral. So there's a lot that we can unpack in general, looking at just the general, let's say, business landscape in Mozambique. But I'd love to focus specifically on what the opportunities are for energy access companies, renewable energy specifically. And we can look at the specific subsectors from IPPs to mini grid operators to, let's say, pay-go operators. And so we can get very sector specific, and we can also get just very generalized as a general approach to the sector. So thank you.
Thank you, Emmett. And then Sarah, also with your finger on the pulse on the ground, you, in addition to running a DARE lab, you're an angel, and you can see obviously the flows of impact capital, but also local capital from angels and funds on the ground. Where are you seeing the investor interest based on your day-to-day experience in the ecosystem?
Thank you, Tara. Happy to be here and also contribute to these discussions. Well, we Idea Lab specifically, we work with emerging companies and emerging initiatives. And obviously, one of the things that is lacking for these companies to grow is this access to capital. And in fact, it is almost inexistent for them. So the growth, it's very slow, and they need to bootstrap and reinvest in their business. So obviously, this is a topic that is very interesting for me and for the work we do. So when we run this entrepreneurship programs, we try to expose these companies to the, to the society, to potential investors, to the different funds that exist. And despite they being small and small initiatives, there are some interest in some sectors. Obviously, agriculture, I would say agriculture, fisheries, and forests are a key sector for the country, and especially the youth. I can start seeing them very involved and looking for these sectors and bringing some innovative products for them. Not the sector by itself, not just agriculture, but also some small processing units for these products and specifically, and I can see the interest of some investors in these areas. Apart from that, and one of the questions that emerged into this prior discussions were the logistics sector, where there is a big demand for this sector, and where there is also a lot of opportunities in the sector. But Hamet is here, and obviously you also recognize, and you already explained the opportunities in the green energy and the green business. We are fellows in other initiatives related to this field. But I also want to bring here, and what I see, it's obvious that tech is a trend, but tech, it's also, I would say, initiatives that go along in the different sectors. And with this COVID situation and the pandemic, there is I see more and more interest, especially for the wealthy Mozambicans, and looking for opportunities in the tech space, the agri-tech, the edu-tech, the fintechs. Yeah, it's a global trend, but here in particular, because it can advance a lot of different things, there's been a specific interest for these initiatives that we are bringing from those sectors. Tech, basically, but connected with agriculture, education, and financial innovations that can bring and improve the lives of the Mozambicans, where I also think that is important for this impact investment and this conversation that we are having here.
Great points, and we're diving into some pretty deep waters, and they're going to keep getting deeper as we understand more about everyone's sectors and work. But before we do that, before we go even deeper, thought I would give a little break for a little bit of refreshment and comic relief. I believe that Sharu from IntelliCap has a fun poll we can do before we get back to the questions. Ooh, some trivia, some geography trivia. I will leave it to our attendees to answer. I will also answer. I'm very unsure about this one.
I will share the correct answer in the chat. Tara, you can continue the conversation.
Oh, come on, Sharu, tell us.
Okay, so the correct answer is 6.
Oh, yay. Great. Sarah, going back to what you were saying, one of the things that I've seen in many countries is how local angels can really build the ecosystem so that more impact capital can come in. Obviously, they don't have the Forex risk. They can do smaller and smaller tickets, which enables the local entrepreneurs who don't have the advantage of being able to bootstrap in euros, GBP, or dollar. They can enable them to get over that hump to the point where they're ready for capital from someone like SF or then VC and PE, etc. I understand that despite being around for over over a year, about a year, there hasn't been that much local angel activity in Mozambique just yet. So I wanted to know, what do you think are the causes of that, outside of course, the global pandemic that we're all recovering from, and how can we in the broader impact ecosystem improve the number of enterprises getting access to these funds? How can we help you all building this local angel and early stage investment ecosystem, whether that's other kinds of catalytic capital that can de-risk, or other ideas that you and your colleagues on the ground have been discussing?
Yes, obviously COVID was a barrier, but it's not the major barrier for the angel activity. I would say that there are two barriers. Obviously, one is the lack of funds itself, but the other is also the lack of a proper framework for these things to be done, and all the financial framework. We were hearing here from you and from Grace also, that basically the DFIs bring these guarantees to the bank guarantees, and there is a reason why they do that. It's because the financial system itself, it's not prepared to include other financial opportunities and other instruments and so on. So I think one of the things that are most important is also to enable these other frameworks and these other opportunities to come to the market and be included. The financial system, it's basically the banking system, and all the other instruments are excluded in this conversation. So in one hand, we started a conversation with Financial Deepening Mozambique, the Ministry of Finance, the central bank, just an observer, to design a new framework, and we expect to have this until the end of the year, a new framework for the capital markets. The reason, and the stock exchange is also in the process. So the reason why we joined these conversations is that we want to make sure that this new framework and these instruments this framework can include the instruments that we can use to leverage these early stage initiatives and financing. As AMBA, one of the initial things that we tried to do was to syndicate and bring, our savings together and invest in the business. But there was no legal structure to do that. So we want to make sure that by the end of the year, something can come up from these studies and discussions that we are having that can enabling this. One of the things that we're also involved as Idea Lab and with the donor, it's trying to put together grant innovation, returnable grant innovation fund.
Oh.
And it will be linked with one of the activities we are doing on the entrepreneurship space. So directly bringing funding to those entrepreneurs we are supporting. But once more, this initiative or the management of this fund has to be done by a bank, which in one hand make it more a commercial bank, which in one hand make it more costly to manage. And in the discussions and the operation of this vehicle is also occurring, and we're trying to figure out, even with the cost of the bank, what can we do to make sure that it's happening. Yeah, and I would say here, one of the things that we also do in our programs is to provide as much as grant prices as possible. Obviously, it's not for everyone. We will have the winners, we could access them, but at least someone are able to have some startup capital and some seeds capital to take the initiatives forward. So there are different things that we're trying to do and put together to make sure that early stage ventures have access to finance.
It's interesting. A few years ago, I remember doing a market study on the Angolan SME finance market. And there were a lot of investors that were willing to do an SME fund there. And it was precisely the issue that you pointed out, the lack of a legal framework that was set up for non-bank financial institutions that held that back. So it's delightful to hear that you all are working on it. And I really hope you can get it done in 2021. And I hope you'll keep everyone on the call abreast, because that can be so transformative for the market. Yes, we know the banks are critical. We also know that they're often requiring more than 150% collateral and charging more than 22 to 25% interest rates, which then affects the OPEX and the financial sustainability of the SMEs that are lucky enough to be in the minority that get bank capital. So given this as a major, financial products barrier, what do you think, Grace? Are these kinds of products actually sustainable for the majority of companies, impact companies that are getting bank loans? And if you think that that may not be the case for the majority, what do you think would be the most effective instruments to resolve these issues without distorting the market? We already know about the credit guarantees, but are there any other instruments that you all are thinking about that start to provide alternatives and start to provide de-riskings that you want to give us some hints, previews, or samples of?
Yeah, it's interesting. The sustainability question is so hard, right? Because on the one hand, the interest rates, being offered by commercial banks aren't sustainable for enterprises, but on the other hand, we know, that grant funding long-term isn't sustainable either. So how do you kind of square that circle? But there is so much in between those two. Obviously that's the whole blended finance conversation. And I think that kind of those in-between structures are a lot of what we're interested in. So, as a DFI, we at the DFC have a financial toolbox, debt and equity and insurance and guarantees. But, so not necessarily in, direct grant making or returnable grants or things like this, but we can look at how we work as kind of US government as a whole, working with USAID and some of their activities, which often have some unique grant making structures. The Millennium Challenge Corporation has a new compact in Mozambique under development that's going to have some interesting components. So really looking at how we can apply a suite of different tools in addition to some of our more straightforward financial tools. But one model I want to highlight in particular that I think has a lot of potential, we recently used in frontier economies in West Africa and the Sahel region, so not Mozambique, but I think there's some kind of degree of shared potential there, is combining our credit guarantee with the provision of first loss grant capital from the USAID West Africa Trade and Investment Hub. So they provided a fund with investable grant capital to service first loss, but not be held in escrow, to actually be able to be invested. And then we provided our standard credit guarantee on any losses that occur past that first loss. So this was a way to kind of combine providing investable capital to a fund while also providing multiple different levels of risk protection to attract additional investments to the fund and provide that necessary comfort in a market that is perceived to be highly risky. So that was something we just did this past year, and definitely a model that we're looking at in other contexts as well. And certainly, outside of the guarantee, DFC provides direct debt financing to enterprises, to funds, where USD debt makes sense, where entirely private sources of funding are unavailable or untenable. We have the ability to offer longer tenors, more specialized repayment schedules, et cetera. We're currently working on a direct lending opportunity in Mozambique with a highly impactful agribusiness that we're investing in alongside an impact investor. So that's something we're excited about, and looking just continued for opportunities where we can deploy our products alongside a mix of other actors and offering different types of capital depending on the needs of the specific product.
That is super duper exciting. And something else exciting, I believe we have another poll coming up from Sharu. Let's see the trivia. You would assume it would be Portuguese.
Yes.
Interesting to know. Emmett, going back to you, apart from the obvious challenges that we're all familiar with, especially those of us who've either launched or supported startups, fundraising, also government support, human resources, and then in Mozambique specifically, there's additional issues such as the infrastructure problem with the roads, electricity. In your view, what do you think are the most pertinent challenges for enterprises on the ground, and the way forward in addressing them? This can be for energy enterprises, or it can also be broader. And if you have ideas for donors, DFIs, foundations, and how we can better help address those issues, feel free to throw them out, because there's certainly several of us on the call.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the question. I just want to say, really quickly, and just to trace back perhaps to our prior point, and as we've all highlighted, the issues we face in the energy sector, writ large, are all what we face in all sectors, whether ag, whether in mining, whether the extractives. I just do want to highlight, some specifics to the energy sector. Mozambique is currently going through the process of overhaul of its electricity regulatory framework as far as provision and for the engagement of the private sector. So there are specific, let's say stars in the sky for us to look forward to as far as an evolving regulatory landscape. Speaking specifically to sources of funding, and we've highlighted the role of donors, and often there is a very important role for the donors to play. I think in the context of Mozambique in the energy space, given it's a nascent sector, we require a lot of hand-holding and bridging between the donors and also commercial funding opportunities. I'd like to maybe cite two examples of concrete programs that are fantastic examples and models that should be looked to. We have KFW's Ecoambiental line that goes through BCI, which provides access to capital at 15% annualized rates, with very amenable terms as far as guarantees, grace periods, and a range of other benefits. These kinds of funding opportunities are fantastic because they create that bridge for the private sector to be able to try and meet the criteria and pass the due diligence of commercial funding entities. And I dare say it is nice to try and baby and let's say coddle nascent sectors in the innovative spaces and the impact spaces too, but we have to hold companies to the same standards, due diligence, financial due diligence requirements when it comes to being able to get to commercial funding. And I say this specifically in the energy space, where when we look at the energy access space, or if we look at energy power generation on the IPP basis, these are very formalized sectors. And us Mozambican entrepreneurs, we have to jump to the rhythm, so to speak, as far as meeting the criteria, the quality levels of international and regional competitors. So, let's not make any excuses for Mozambican entrepreneurs. I think what we do need is, and I think Sarah has really highlighted the requirements for an enabling environment for various actors, various funding programs, and various models that facilitate, help incubate these nascent sectors, but also help us develop and meet the criteria so we can eventually meet the terms for reaching a financial close on competitive, let's say, capital on a larger basis. So just to say, specifically in Mozambique, I did mention the BCI fund, which is a great example. In the on-grid space, we also have another program that is sponsored by the European Union called ProLair, where this program has created a pipeline of fundable programs whereby there's going to be a public auction for the private sector to bid on these specific projects. So this kind of, let's say reverses the process for project development, kind of de-risks the process for the private sector, and is an example of subsidizing, let's say, the risk that is associated with project development in the renewable energy space in the context of Mozambique. So there's a lot of innovation at play. There's a large role for commercial financiers. There's a large role that is currently being developed by the donor space. We have examples of consumer and subsidies in the PAYGO space, developed by programs by GIZ, for example. So there is a lot of innovation, and this is definitely to be applauded. But I also do think we need to reconcile some of the the landscape issues that we've all highlighted that do make investing in the context of Mozambique a little bit more arduous, let's say writ large. Thank you.
It's interesting because, for a while, the security situation was improving, then it was worsening. There have been ups and downs in regards to security on top of all of the various business enabling environment challenges that you've mentioned, which is why Third Way Africa, you don't have that many peers and colleagues. Both Emmett and Grace and Sarah have pointed to the way that DFIs and donors and other ecosystem players are stepping in to help de-risk the sector. I wanted to know from the perspective of Third Way Africa, have you all been participating in or seen any unique, truly transformative models for catalytic capital to come in to do this de-risking? And also, which kinds of de-risking do you think would be most necessary from DFIs, donors, and other catalytic capital, whether that's technical assistance, insurance? And also, are there any drawbacks? We know the upsides, but are there any drawbacks that donors and other providers of catalytic capital need to be considering?
Very big question. Let me see if I can do my best to answer this. If I could give a definitive answer, I think my pay grade would be much higher. In terms of innovative financial products, I do think that we would like to see more kind of quasi equity instruments, more mezzanine financing in the market. The idea of giving local companies the ability essentially to pay back, particularly in agriculture where your cash flows are really cyclical, to be able to essentially pay back when revenues are solid and when you actually have earnings to do so, as opposed to a debt product or as opposed to a purely equity product. The other thing that we find quite interesting is we're seeing, at least in the private markets, less in the impact space, are capital loans, which give funds like us the ability to borrow based off of investor commitments. So in a traditional, fund scenario where you essentially make a cash call when it's required, and you give 15 days to your investors to actually put the cash in that's required, injecting a debt instrument there that essentially allows the vehicle to borrow based upon having blue chip or really solid investors. And then that can even push essentially those cash calls back a year or two in the fund, which obviously increases the IRR for those investors. And so there are a lot of interesting, instruments in the market. I do feel like they tend to get tested out in private circles before DFIs are willing to jump on board, especially for the more risky products. I think that the other side of thing is, we oftentimes when we talk about catalyzing private capital, we talk about it in a product sense. And I think, that's important. There's a lot of good products in the market, but we know that they haven't completely solved the issue, which is we don't have enough private capital flowing into high-risk sectors, into high-risk geographies. And I think a part of that as well is looking at the overall donor ecosystem and not necessarily just the financial components. And, for example, we do obviously a lot of investment in very rural areas. And I think that when we focus too much on the financial side of things, we forget about the fact that a lot of the risk that investors are concerned about is operational risk. And a lot of your role as an investor in particularly rural areas, underdeveloped areas, means that you're essentially putting a lot of service delivery and you're putting a lot of sort of development aspects on your own balance sheets. A lot of investors that they're coming into sort of more rural environments don't recognize that as being the primary economic driver in a region, you're oftentimes also the primary driver for infrastructure and for electricity, and you're also the primary builder of schools. And even for some of our investments in our farm investments, our ag investments, we're also the primary center for resolving conflicts in the local area. And I think that we sort of underestimate all of that investment, and we underestimate the fact that private sector in a lot of these places ends up becoming a stand-in for local government, and that makes investments significantly more risky. And I think that part of the solution there is not just more tailored financial products that can de-risk, but is also coming at these investments with a more holistic approach and allowing donors, especially donors that are investing in infrastructure, to co-invest with vehicles like ours and with the private sector. And I know, Abe, I think there's been a level of reticence in doing that and not wanting to subsidize private sector returns. But I think that this is essentially what governments have traditionally done throughout history. And I think is a good role for the development community, is to invest in that service delivery, specifically to communities and to areas that there is a high need for private sector investment. Is the long answer to a very difficult question.
No, it's not long enough, Ian. There's still so much that we want to dig into, but just in fairness to the questions that I know that will come from the group, we'll save that for another day, and we'll let Sharu give us another quick poll. I've seen this question in the chat, and I myself, as a Gender Lens investor, was chomping at the bit to ask about this. Mozambique actually is doing really good when it comes to women's entrepreneurship and representation in government. Nearly half of the informal firms are actually a majority owned by women. And although when it comes to the formal firms, it's much less, it's about 24%. So you can see the potential contributions to the economy. I believe that if there were economic equity when it comes to business ownership and the gender wage gap, we'd add 12 trillion to GDP. So this is at least a few billion at the national GDP level in Mozambique. So given all this, women entrepreneurs still do face a lot of challenges in accessing finance. Are there any initiatives that your firms are currently doing or that you've heard about in Mozambique that are actively tackling the gender angle, specifically improving women's access to finance and helping them scale? And this is to the whole panel.
Yeah, I can kick us off.
Cool.
Through the 2X challenge, I think DFIs as a whole have made this a real commitment. And here at the DFC, it's an utmost priority for us, setting ambitious targets and prioritizing projects that are owned by women, led by women, employ women, provide products or services that are intended to empower women. So basically every opportunity that we're looking at right now, we're looking at how it fits in that lens. The agribusiness I mentioned earlier in Mozambique that we're looking at direct financing that has a majority female workforce. That's something that's very important to us as we're looking at the impact of that potential transaction. In addition, one of our existing credit guarantees with a microfinance institution in Mozambique specifically says that 50% of the loans under the guarantee must be for women borrowers. And I think it makes a lot of sense in this case to target that for micro enterprises in particular, because as you know, so many informal sectors is where we see so many women entrepreneurs. So ensuring that they get financing at that informal level, I think is critical to helping ultimately them to scale and formalize. But it is frankly a struggle, for the MFI to even reach that target that we've set for them. One thing that they tell us is that they often get enterprises coming for loans where, they say, oh, well, we know this enterprise is owned by a woman, but it's her husband that's actually applying for the loan. So it's, there's a lot of other things at play here sometimes that I think just easy targets like we can put on don't necessarily address, but certainly it's something that we care a lot about, and we're trying to experiment in different ways to find how to be most impactful in addressing.
Have you seen any gender lens funds or initiatives that are being rolled out by larger financial institutions, whether it's banks or any of the VC or PE funds?
In Mozambique specifically, I can't think of any. Some of my colleagues that are in country may know more, but definitely in other countries, I think it's been a lot of, but I haven't seen it as much in Mozambique.
And maybe some of the other panelists might know, so they can also chime in. Emmett, Sarah, Ian, other things you've seen.
Yeah, maybe I can add, you know, all this credit lines and things, they also evolve and change. But I remember a particular time, I think it was in 2016, there were specific credit, more available specific credit lines for women in the different commercial banks. They were pushing somehow for it with very good conditions, I would say. And it occurred for 2 years maybe, and then suddenly things disappeared. I personally was looking, I remember having this opportunity, I applied for it, it was great, but then in certain point in time, it disappears, especially when the interest rates start getting very high. But I remember at that time, and through our Femtech program, which is an acceleration program for women, I know that most of these women that had part of the program during those years, they were able to access these specific lines from the commercial banks. I believe that probably a specific DFI we're working with the banks and bringing those credit lines. I don't know who, because we just see the bank up front. Yeah, but I remember that at that time and that those opportunities, and that they serve a certain number of women, and they were able to get it. So, but right now I can't mention a specific product that is being used for them or for us.
That is so interesting that it would disappear, and also that it would have special interest rates and then just disappear into thin air. Emmett, Ian, any comments on this?
Look, I would like maybe just to, corroborate that there is a tendency for there to be trends in the various sectors and for things to come in and out of fashion. But I also say there is a transition in the fact that a lot of these issues are also becoming cross-cutting. And so there's a lot of streamlining, or is it mainstreaming, let's say, of gender issues across various initiatives. But not to say that, these issues have lost, let's say, their weight or their importance in this current juncture. I will say that part of it is what's important is changing the narrative. And a lot of the work that Idea Lab does is about really highlighting and focusing in on the few and maybe the rare case studies and actors that really do provide a frame of reference just beyond just being case studies to inspire the rest of us in some cases. As an association, I will say, while we can't provide the actual financial instruments and target them specifically with, addressing gender concerns, one activity initiative that we have strived to promote and continue to do so is to focus on the case studies, the profiles of specific individual professional women who operate in the renewable energy space writ large. And one classic example of a partner organization that kind of symbolizes and emblemifies, let's say, this kind of initiative is Mozambique Women in Energy, which is a group of Mozambican professional women across the energy space, but there is a subset of focus in the renewable energy focus. And to be honest, a key driver of innovation in the energy space as a whole departs from innovations and a more evolved discourse that pertains to renewable energy. So here we have a case study of an association that has direct linkages with us as an association that is doing a lot of work at championing the specific narratives of professional women in the space. And I think, this goes towards a larger discussion that we haven't really, fully dug into, but I think we've addressed writ large, is the question of local content development. And so when we talk about human resource development and really building the actual technical capacity and the ecosystem, focusing on women's entrepreneurial development and promotional development is, a key focus of that. And associations and entities like this, are actually, cornerstone enablers in this space. So I'd love to highlight those initiatives and say, it's more of these kinds of professional associations and initiatives that we need in the space. Thank you.
Really fascinating. I've taken a note of it, and also something that you all might find interesting in the future. There is a growing convergence of gender finance and climate finance. In fact, one of the things that we're looking at for the future is for our investees, is it possible to bring the two together, i.e. monetizing their gender impact and their greenhouse emissions reductions? So that's just something that when you mention these parties that are at the intersection of energy and gender, that opportunity and that convergence could be particularly interesting as well. I know that that was a bit academic, so I'm going to also segue into another fun poll from Sharu from Intellicrap.
I think this would be the last one for all the people here. Let's see how much you know about how beautiful the country is. Yes, beaches it is.
Correct. You guys have me very jealous calling in from foggy, cold London today, but I hope you enjoy your 80 miles of coastline with a lot of grudging jealousy. I'm saying that. Some questions from the audience, guys. This first one will be also to the entire panel. Our guest wants to know about innovation and specifically the context of innovation and replication. So investors are often talking about innovation when it comes to startups, but in economies such as Mozambique, frontier economies, do you all think that replication may be a more successful or more priority strategy, i.e. taking successful enterprise models from other developing countries and then retrofitting or contextualizing for Mozambique? Anyone on the panel can answer this one.
I just want to applaud this question and say, in the context of Mozambique, people often say this in one shape or another. We don't need to invent the wheel. We just need to put 4x4 on it for the Mozambique context. We don't need a lot of innovation. We just need to be able to operationalize. And in the context of Mozambique, when we talk about business development, this is not about pie in the sky, thinking. This is about practical. How do we take ideas off the paper and breathe life into them and operationalize them in the context of Mozambique? So, I definitely applaud this line of engagement and say, we have to keep things to basics. And I'm sure Sarah has, a lot to add on that point, actually. Thank you.
Unless Sarah wants to go, I also have some thoughts on that. I full-heartedly agree with Emmett. I think that this also dovetails well with the comments he had about local content. And the fact that, we are oftentimes, when we're discussing local content, which is essentially how do you increase the amount of Mozambican workforce and Mozambican goods and service providers that can essentially tap into the LNG ecosystem up north and so all of that investment ecosystem. And I think that we are, unfortunately, doomed if we're too pie in the sky. What we really do need to be thinking about is, our core industries here. We can look to a lot of other examples where they've had huge wins. We're not at the point where we're developing a tech ecosystem in Mozambique. We're really focused on agriculture, really focused on construction. There's a lot of sort of, old school industries and industrials that we still need to be investing in that are going to be large job creators. And I think that we can look at neighboring countries and other successes and leverage those examples. I think that there's a room probably for innovation as well as for repetition. But I think that there's probably a healthy injection of taking a look at what others have done and where they failed and succeeded that we should be taking into account.
Thanks, Ian. Any others?
I would say that innovation is key, even for the more traditional, as Ian was saying, even for the traditional industries, because we need to accelerate. We need to do things fast. We are far beyond all this enterprise development. So we need to find ways of doing things differently, quicker, and with less the less resource possible, because we don't have, as we're seeing here, we don't have the resources we need to do. So I really, through the work we were doing, this is what we were trying to push, bringing innovative ideas, concepts, even if they are being applied somewhere. So replication, yes, but with a lot of focus on how we can accelerate things here, because we are very far behind.
Grace, any comments or?
No, I think my fellow panelists really covered it. I think, you know, it's as much as we can bring in proven, you know, enterprises, but also proven financial strategies, financial products from other markets that are similar. That's, I think, another area where we can learn so much and don't need to be reinventing the wheel. But certainly, you know, it's a combination. I think all of the above is what's needed at this point.
This next question is for Sarah, but I'm actually going to extend it to the entire group, because we've all given unique, well, you all have given unique perspectives on a variety of different relevant financial instruments. So the participant was saying, Sarah, you spoke about returnable grants, but do you think that's the most effective and sustainable instrument? And how do you think implementation of returnable grants would be most successful, whether that's through incubators managing a fund or grant competition? I'd love it if everyone can weigh in on repayable grants, as well as other instruments that they're seeing being most critical going forward, and any caveats they want to add about those instruments.
Thank you, Tara. I, in fact, replied the question in the chat, but we can, I can tell that at this moment, I really don't know what is more effective, because I think that we need to test these different instruments and approach and see how they work. We are having this discussion. I believe that in the next few months, we'll have something specific related to this incubator we are managing. The idea is the fund to be managed by a commercial bank, obviously with a fee to cover their costs, not with the incubator, not in the incubator, but I think that that is not also the work for the incubator to do, unless they have a steering committee that can look and review all these applications. But AJ Kumar was also proposing here, we do a lot of competitions where the prizes are grants, so this work, but we need to have more cash available to distribute, let's say, usually very small amounts, but that can allow the companies to give a small step or get a license, or that enables them to move and going into a second step in progress in their business. The other thing that Jay Kumar was proposing also here was if the incubators should manage. I don't think so. Or if how these returnable grants would work. Obviously, you have to have someone to manage and make sure that the incubator can bring a different component here, is that because they know the business, they know the people, and they have this close relationship with them, even after that. And through business advisor, we can triangulate the business advisor, the fund manager, and the entrepreneur, and make sure that the risks of the business are de-risked in terms of management, and be there to try to control things and make sure that things work.
I was hoping that we could get answers from all of the panelists, but I see that we're at 2 to session close. And so I wanted to be sure that I would be able to hand this back over to Harish and Sharu. But first, I wanted to thank you all for an absolutely fascinating conversation. You all are doing so much for the Mozambican ecosystem, and it's been really enjoyable. And I hope there'll be more opportunities for us to continue learning from each other, and for all of the attendees to reach out to us so that we can continue to support that ecosystem together. And with that, thank you to IntelliCap for convening this session. And I'll hand it back over to you, Harish and Sharu.
Yes, thank you so much, Tara. Thank you everyone for being a part of the session. Thank you speakers for agreeing to take part in this conversation. I'm sure this is just a start, at least from IntelliCap's perspective. This is just the start of our focus on frontier economies. I mean, we would strive to develop more and more research on frontier economies. Thank you, Flaubert, for trusting us with this engagement. We would come out with a public-facing report very soon. I mean, we are in the process of designing it, and we would release it probably in the next month or so. All right. Thank you, everyone, and looking forward to catching up with you once again. I will be on touch on email. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.